Hi, 10th graders. At this point in your social issues research podcast project, you should be done taking your research notes. In 5.5, you worked on organizing those notes into subtopics, figuring out which areas needed more research, and at this point, you are ready to start outlining your podcast. So in your packet, you will see 5.6 is the podcast outline. In this video, we are going to talk about how to fill out this outline in your packet. So you'll be answering a couple questions here in the outline, and I'm going to walk you through some examples and how to do this. So we are in the brainstorming phase. What will interest the listener of our podcast? How are we going to hook their attention? And how are we going to share all of the knowledge that we've learned about our topics? So we're going to be looking at an example of how a student could fill in this outline if their topic was sexual harassment. So this is something that a student did last year, and this is how they answered the questions on the outline. The first question that you're going to be thinking about is, why is this topic interesting? What has been most interesting for you as you have researched the topic? So you all picked your own topics, so I'm really hoping that there are a lot of things that you find interesting about the topic that you chose. So this student chose to answer the question and said, I had no idea there was a difference between sexual harassment and sexual assault. I didn't know that sexual harassment was a broader term and it can range from sexual remarks to physical advances. Sexual assault is when someone is physically forced to engage in a sexual act against their will. They are similar and are both forms of sexual violence, and they are both not the victim's fault. So this is why this topic was interesting to the student who chose it, and something really interesting that they learned. So I want you to answer that first question in your packet now. Why is your topic interesting to you? The second question in your outline is the what's in it for me? So what will your audience gain by listening to the podcast? Why should they care about your topic? What are they going to learn from listening to your podcast? So we're trying to put ourselves in our audience's shoes. Just saying an issue is important often doesn't get the job done, doesn't get people engaged. So how can you make sure your topic feels really engaging and interesting to the person listening to your podcast? This student wrote, they would have knowledge on how to deal with sexual harassment by noticing the signs. It might happen to a friend or a colleague, and they would be able to handle the situation. They would be able to take measures against it and help others going through it. So this person is saying their podcast is going to help people because you never know, like this might happen to someone that you know, and you can learn about it so that you would know how to help your friend or colleague if they experienced this. So go ahead and answer number 2 in your packet. What will your audience gain by listening to your podcast? Number 3 in your outline. The question is, how will you hook the audience? Is there a big, compelling idea that's really going to draw your listener in and want them to keep listening? Is there a character or a person whose story should be prioritized or at the front and center of your podcast? Is there an emotional or intellectual thread that can run throughout the story? Are there ear-grabbing ways to attract the audience? This is your chance to really be creative. I know that all of you understand that a lot of us these days have really short attention spans, right? Like even these videos, they are only like 6 to 8 minutes because we know that people don't want to sit there and listen to a really long thing. They're also not going to be engaged if you don't hook the listener and bring them into your podcast. So think about like when you're scrolling on TikTok or something like that, what is it that grabs your attention and makes you want to keep listening or keep watching? So this is the hook that this student chose to use on sexual harassment. They chose to start off their podcast by listing a bunch of celebrities or famous people that were survivors of sexual harassment. So they said, Alyssa Milano, Gabrielle Union, Lucy Hale, Lena Dunham, Lady Gaga, all of these famous people. You might have heard of them. They're famous people, but they were also once victims of sexual harassment. They shared their stories in the media about what happened during their traumatic events. They weren't the only ones. Lots of victims came forth and shared their stories, even forming movements like #MeToo that shows survivors that they aren't alone and helps improve awareness on sexual violence. So you can see they used like a celebrity story to draw our attention into the podcast. Question number 4 on your outline. What do you hope the audience will remember after hearing the podcast? What will the audience remember when it's over? So we often don't remember a whole story. We usually just remember little snippets that really stand out to us. Maybe that's a particular quote or a scene or a certain person's story or idea. So put yourself in the shoes of the listener to your podcast and think about, as they're walking down the street with their AirPods in and they're listening to your podcast, what is one thing you want them to remember at the end? Is it a question that they're going to be still pondering? What is it? So in 3 to 5 sentences here, what's your takeaway? This student wrote, I would want them to remember that it is never the victim's fault and they should never have to face hate from others after what has happened to them. I'd like to advise them to tell someone they can trust because it's easier to handle with someone else by your side. There are many helplines and places to report sexual harassment, one of which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, or RAINN, which keeps the victim's information confidential. There are laws that are established against workplace sexual harassment, like the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So they want the takeaway to be that it's not your fault and that there are resources you can use to get support. All right, so that is your step 1 in 5.6. I want you to go through this outline, fill out these boxes, 3 to 5 sentences for each question in your outline. This is really going to help you think about what you want to focus on in your podcast. Once you are done with the outline, 5.6 step 2 is to listen to this sample podcast on Schoology. It's an Edpuzzle video of a short TED Talk, and you are going to be answering these questions in your notes. So you'll go over to Schoology, open up this 5.6 step 2 sample podcast video. You will really have to listen closely to this podcast in order to answer these questions. And this is a great example of how to hook the listener, how to focus on a couple key points. Your should do is going to be listening to another sample podcast. All of these are posted on Schoology. Choose one that you want to listen to in order to get another example of a good podcast. Finally, step 4 is going to be outlining your podcast as your mastery check. So you'll head over to Schoology, 5.6 mastery check. It's 20 points, and you are going to outline that podcast right there in the mastery check. All right, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.